I'm Ralph Begleiter, the Director of the Center for Political Communication. Global Agenda is supported by the University of Delaware's Institute for Global Studies and the Department of Political Science and International Relations and the Department of Communication. For most Americans, Europe is the closest economic partner we have in the world, though that picture is changing with increasing focus on Asia and Latin America. Older Americans, and some of you are here tonight, think of Europe in terms of two great world wars. Younger Americans think of Europe as the place to find great chocolate, great skiing, great beer, cheese, legendary cars, and of course, the Eiffel Tower and the Roman Colosseum. America's strongest political and military allies are in Europe, along with 3 other nuclear weapons nations with veto power at the United Nations. And Europe is a huge trading partner and competitor of the United States. When the U.S. goes to war in Libya, Iraq, Afghanistan, the U.S. looks to Europe first for help and doesn't always get it. Our guest tonight has spent much of her professional life navigating the political waters between the United States and Europe. She's Heather Conley, Senior Fellow and Director of the Europe Program at one of Washington's most respected bipartisan think tanks, the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Through the first term of President George W. Bush, through the post-9/11 period, and through the start of the Iraq War, Heather Conley was a top official in the State Department's Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs. During the second term of President Clinton in the 1990s, she worked outside government, but always on European issues. And just at the end of the Cold War, she worked in the State Department on issues related to the newly independent former Soviet states. She's also been in a leadership position at the National Red Cross and on humanitarian issues inside the State Department. Heather Conley earned her BA in International Studies at West Virginia Wesleyan College and her Master's in International Relations at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies in Washington. I'm very tempted to tell you more about her early career, but maybe we'll get into that a little later in the Q&A. In the meantime, please welcome Heather Conley to the University of Delaware.
Good evening. It is a great pleasure to be here with you at the beautiful campus of the University of Delaware. It's always good to get out of Washington, so thank you for your kind invitation. Ralph gave me an extraordinary challenge, and you made me think, so I thank you for always making me think about the changing role, America's changing role in Europe. For the last 4 years, as director of the Europe program at CSIS, I have been focused on the European debt crisis, analyzing it, trying to understand it. And I had to pause and think, my goodness, the U.S. role in Europe is changing. Actually, it's changing dramatically. So this gives me a wonderful opportunity to share my thoughts. So I hope for the next 25 minutes or so, I don't want to go too long, to give you my sense of the relationship, the transatlantic relationship, where it's been, where it is today, and where I think it's going. The wonderful thing about Europe, we have so much to talk about. The military security role, the debt crisis, our ongoing relations anywhere in the world. So there's richness for discussion. So I want to listen to you and hear from you, and we can begin our discussion. So with that, I think it's best to begin when anyone thinks about the U.S.-European relationship, the transatlantic relationship, to think about it in 3 pillars. The first pillar, military, security, intelligence. Of course, you think of NATO, our long-standing alliance since 1949, where we are committed by treaty. Article 5 of the NATO treaty says that an attack against one is an attack against all. That is really the cornerstone of our relationship with Europe, but it certainly goes beyond that in intelligence sharing and security cooperation. That's pillar number 1. Pillar number 2 is what you've been hearing a lot about and reading headlines over the last several years, the economic relationship, the trade and investment relationship. Now, the headlines coming from Europe have certainly not been happy headlines, but it reminds us of this pillar that actually is really important. Europe is one of our largest, if not our largest, trade and investment partner. About 20% of American exports go to Europe. European investment in the United States is very significant. Together, the United States and Europe represent 30% of global GDP. We are really big when we act together as an economic bloc. So that's a very important pillar. The third pillar, I call it the invisible pillar, is our shared values, our history, and our culture. In some ways, that's our most important pillar. That's really who we are, and together we stand and defend democracy. We may not always agree on everything, but we share a common history and certainly a common culture. So those three pillars, military, the economics, the values, that really makes the United States a European power. Now, you may scratch your head on that. The United States, a European power. But I'm going to make that argument, that in fact, the U.S. is a European power. Now, Ralph gave me my assignment of looking at the last 20 years or so, really since the end of the Cold War, looking at this relationship. I thought I would be an overachiever tonight and actually move a little farther back. I cannot resist, because next year is the 100th anniversary of the First World War. And I actually think this is going to be a little instructive as we look at that 100th anniversary. I'm going to grossly overgeneralize what were the origins of that war. Nationalism, very complicated balance of power politics, and mistaken signals and assumptions about allies and about who would side with whom. And of course, it happened, an assassination by a radical Serb of an Austrian archduke. But if you look back at the totality of the last 100 years of transatlantic relations, the First World War, the troubled interwar period, the Second World War, the Cold War, the post-Cold War, now today, America has been there. We are a European power. We were born of a European power. We separated and revolted from a European power. We are inspired by European ideals in the French Revolution. Our country was built upon waves and waves of European immigrants. This is what makes that value pillar invisible, but so powerful. We are a European power. But you know, historically, America has always been a very reluctant European power. We begrudgingly arrive quite late, and usually only after being either attacked or prompted to go. But once we arrive in Europe, we arrive fully, prepared to make and take enormous sacrifice, and at great cost. Over the last 100 years, when the United States was a very proactive European power, we were at our very best. Think 1947, the Marshall Plan. Think about the creation of NATO in 1949. That was when we were at our best. But today, that is changing. We are returning to our reluctance, pushed very much by our own U.S. domestic concerns, our economic concerns, and our view that Europe can take care of itself. Our focus must be on other regions of potential growth and competition, like China. But this wasn't how it was supposed to be. Don't you remember the West was victorious at the end of the Cold War? And to save time, I'm in the full belief that a picture says 1,000 words. I'm about to go through 20 years of history very quickly. So if you'll turn your attention to the screen, let's take a little walk through the last 20 years, shall we? Remember this historic event, the fall of the Berlin Wall. Followed by, according to President Putin, the worst geopolitical incident of the 20th century was the collapse of the Soviet Union. NATO and the West was victorious, prompting what George H.W. Bush called a new world order stemming from this victory. And then Europe met its first challenge after German reunification. It met the crisis in Bosnia and Sarajevo. Europe did not know how to handle this, and it took the United States to reappear into Europe and take matters into its own hands. and help with the liberation of Bosnia. And then, shortly thereafter, the Kosovo campaign began. Again, U.S. leadership was critical. And then in 1999, NATO expanded. It welcomed 3 new members, former members of the Warsaw Pact: Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic. This was very much its strong American urging to return a Europe that was whole, free, and at peace. Ralph, you told me you were covering that event at CNN. And then the world changed, and the American agenda changed. For Europe, this was a moment of great solidarity with the United States. It was the first time that NATO ever declared an Article 5. An attack against one, the United States, was an attack against all. Of course, no one ever envisioned, no one at NATO, since its creation in 1949, ever imagined that the attack would be against the United States. And then our agenda moved away from Europe, and it went to Afghanistan, where Europe followed us. Former Secretary of Defense Don Rumsfeld said NATO would be out of business if it would not go out of area or out of business. So NATO went to Afghanistan and formed part of the international security force. And then we had a very deep European divide over the war in Iraq. Some European allies supported the United States, particularly those in Central Europe. Those in Western Europe, particularly France and Germany, strongly opposed the new direction that America was presenting it. And then another dramatic change in transatlantic relations happened: the inauguration of Barack Obama. So much about the president's election inspired Europe. Many European colleagues would come up to me and say, "We could never do that here. How inspiring, how inspiring." And the expectations for President Obama were so great. The relationship with Europe under the President George W. Bush was deeply tattered after Iraq. It improved in the second term, but it really, for a generation, really impaired the transatlantic relationship. So when President Obama was elected, there was great euphoria, so much euphoria that the Nobel Peace Committee gave President Obama the Nobel Prize. I think in some ways for not being President Bush. The Nobel Prize also gave the EU the Peace Prize, but we can talk about that a little bit. And then the relationship changed again. Although the Iraq War was devastating to transatlantic relations, actually, I think the financial crisis is a much more deep-seated and difficult crisis for the transatlantic relationship. It's causing a return of nationalism. This is the most recent picture from Cyprus, where they're saying no to the EU, and it's fanning the flames of anti-German sentiment across southern Europe. So, how have these 3 pillars changed today as we enter a new period of great uncertainty? How will these 3 pillars look in the future that I mentioned? The military, the economics, and the values. Let's start with the military. After a decade of U.S. military spending to fund 2 wars, U.S. military spending has dwarfed the rest of Europe and the rest of the alliance. Today, NATO's budget is dramatically out of balance. The United States represents 77% of NATO's budget, with the other 28 allies representing the other percentage. And of that 23%, the United Kingdom, France, and Germany really represent the bulk of that percentage. Here's a little quiz. There are only 3 NATO members today that spend over 2% of their gross domestic product on defense. You know the first one, the U.S. Can you guess the next one? United Kingdom. You know the third one? Greece. And it's not to support NATO. This is for Greece has spent over 5% of its GDP, and it was to prevent a war with Turkey, another NATO ally. Estonia, the small Baltic country, may be added to that list very shortly. European forces, for the majority, cannot be deployed overseas. As I mentioned in Afghanistan, European support for Afghanistan was support for the United States. They did not consider Afghanistan to be a security threat. They did it because of us. And then after the very divisive Iraq War, many European allies actually gave more troops to Afghanistan, declaring that Afghanistan was the good war because Iraq was so divisive. But throughout Europe, Afghanistan has always been a very unpopular war. Most recently, Libya provides a new model potentially for NATO. This, of course, was U.S. leadership from behind. But the trick was the operation absolutely required U.S. military support, a lot of U.S. military support, from air-to-air refueling, precision-guided munitions, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance. Our allies, particularly the British and the French, who in the early stages led the operation, could not have done it without the United States. What we also found in Libya is that our European allies quickly ran out of precision-guided munitions and very valuable assets. In effect, they could not sustain operations for a very long period of time. Now, most recently, we have Mali, where the French recently militarily intervened. And when they asked others to contribute, the contributions were very slow, if they came at all, some requesting repayment and others just offering training. Is this the new approach for NATO, where only a few allies go forward? In Libya, only 9 out of the 29 NATO allies actually participated in the operation. Will it be more of a coalition of the willing, or will NATO act together in the future? That is a big question mark for the first pillar. The second pillar, economics. As I mentioned, this is the U.S. and the European Union are the largest economic bloc, but because of the debt crisis, attitudes have really hardened on both sides of the Atlantic. And the dialogue goes something like this. The United States got us into this mess, says Europe. We would not have a crisis today if the Americans would not have had their subprime mortgage mess. What Americans say about Europe as they follow the debt crisis, Europe can't solve its own problems, and it is causing the American economy not to recover as quickly as possible. The real secret is we're a dim reflection of each other. We both have high debt. We both have high deficits. We both have political paralysis. The only difference, there's 2 differences for Europe. Europe, over the last decade, with the exception of Germany, has not had any economic growth, which has exacerbated its problems. But add to this, Europe is about to experience a demographic crisis beginning in 2020, when its elder population cannot be supported by a smaller and younger labor force. This will be Europe's challenge now and in the future. It's interesting about history, because transatlantically, our histories interpret economic crises very differently. For the U.S., the Great Depression meant unemployment, very long lines. But for the Germans, the interwar period and that instability meant inflation. So while we would never tolerate 26% unemployment like Spain is experiencing today, neither will Germany politically tolerate high on inflation, because we both see this as a point of instability. And in Germany, inflation, particularly for an elderly population, is particularly corrosive. But there's some good news on this front. The Obama administration recently announced a new initiative, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. It has a dreadful acronym called TTIP. It doesn't roll off the tongue, but the idea behind TTIP is to harness the energy of this economic bloc and to make it work more productively, not only because we have the largest economic space, but it's also a relationship designed to set new international trade and investment standards, which are going to be particularly important for emerging economies like China and like India. That's pillar number 2. How does that third pillar look, that values pillar? Today, we tend to look at that values pillar with a lot of gooey sentimentality, and we don't operationalize our shared values. We value democracy and human rights. We sanction other countries when they don't obey international law. On the United Nations Security Council, who does the United States turn to first to work and coordinate on sanctions or other policies? Of course, the British and the French. They don't necessarily look immediately to Russia or China. This is our shared values and our shared democracy. We also have shared views on the power of humanitarian and development assistance. Combined, the United States and the European Union represent 80% of official development assistance around the world. But let's be clear, both the United States and Europe have lost some important credibility and legitimacy globally. After Afghanistan and Iraq and our economic crises, there's a crisis of confidence in Western democracy and capitalism, and we need to regain global trust. So, how will this relationship work in the future? I'm going to paint two scenarios, and you can maybe we'll have a little quiz, and so you can raise your hand which scenario you think the United States relationship will look like for Europe. Here's the optimistic future. That TTIP, that Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, is successfully negotiated, and the transatlantic relationship sets new international trade and investment standards and helps reinvigorate both of our economies. NATO regroups after Afghanistan. It may do less, but it's a much more cohesive alliance. Europe begins to increase its defense spending and seems to want to play a larger role in security. With stronger economies, the transatlantic relationship turns outward and works together regionally and hope to counter growing regional balance of power politics. All right, that's the optimistic scenario. What does a less optimistic scenario look like? Europe and the United States turn inward to focus on their national economies. Political leadership only exists from one election to the next. The United States further reduces its military presence in Europe for cost-saving purposes. Europe exhibits growing nationalism and populism. And with the exception of Germany, Europe falls further behind in global competitiveness. U.S. global leadership continues to diminish. The U.S. increasingly blames Europe for its economic unevenness. Transatlantic economic tensions rise. The French insist on protectionism, and TTIP stalls. Europe begins to take unilateral action in North Africa and the Middle East in the absence of U.S. leadership. NATO is no longer a relevant framework for collective action. European defense spending continues to decline. Europe seeks a stronger economic presence in Asia, relying on the U.S. military to provide regional security. So, here's your quiz. Who believes that the more optimistic scenario is what's in store? Raise your hand. I love American optimism. Thank you for your optimism. Who thinks the less optimistic scenario may be the one that's more likely? Yeah. I'm going to vote with you guys. I'm less optimistic than I wish I was. I believe in the importance of this relationship. If the last 100 years has not proven our sacrifice, our devotion to this relationship, when it hits troubled shores, certainly it hits troubled economic times, now is not the time for the United States to do less. It is time for the United States to do more if we value the relationship. But it hits us at a terrible time. We're so domestically distracted. Europe is domestically distracted. And the ghosts from the past, the rise of nationalism, populism, xenophobia, anti-Semitism is on the rise in Europe. These are important signals that we must pay attention to. And we must be involved. If we're not involved, we'll be involved later and at great cost, as our history tells us. And with that, I look forward to your questions. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Heather. I got a couple of questions to follow up on some points you made. At the very end, you brought together the nationalism issue and the financial issue, the financial difficulties in the United States and in Europe. What are the implications, do you think, of increasing isolation in the United States, increasing nationalism in Europe, and the financial crisis in both continents? don't they serve as an effective time bomb that is, even if the two continents want to work together, is going to explode in our faces and make it impossible to do so?
Well, I think it's so important that we see this problem as a problem that we have to solve together. As I mentioned, we're very similar in what we're facing. Europe has different elements to it. We don't suffer demographically because of immigration here. We have economic growth, but we share the same problem. So instead of pointing a finger at each other, and that's what we're tending to do right now, pointing to each other, that we need to look at how together we can find innovation, growth, technology, things that can help grow our economies so we can return to health and become more outward-looking in our orientation, not inward-looking. Right now, the environment does not seem that it's right for that, and I'll give you an example. So our Treasury Department goes to Europe a lot, and former Secretary Geithner must have visited Europe 20-plus times, and he told them, you need a TARP, you need to do a big fiscal stimulus package. And the European leaders said, we aren't going to do that. That's not how we solve our problems. And oh, by the way, the United States, I don't need your advice on how to fix a financial crisis that you started. And that got very strong feelings in Europe. It was not welcomed advice. And then, of course, Europe also offers their thoughts on our debt and our deficit. We're not solving the problem together. We're actually solving it against one another. We have to look at this and focus on it and be involved in it. At the end of the day, it's actually not just a financial crisis. Europe is experiencing a banking crisis, a competitive crisis, a fiscal crisis, and it's also experiencing what all of the totality of it is. It's a political crisis. It does not know how to solve this problem. It's in a monetary union that has so many divergent economies, it's working against each other. So Europe needs some help, we need to offer that help, and so far the United States hasn't been as supportive as I would like to see it.
I think at the end of your remarks in your optimism and pessimism scenarios, in the optimistic scenario, you said Europe would increase its defense spending. And I want to ask you about, is that really something the United States would like? I'd like to hear you spin that out for a minute. Would we want Germany to spend more money on its defense? Would we want France to spend more money on its defense? Do we want Britain to spend more money on its defense? What are the implications for their economies? What are the implications for the U.S. role, not just in Europe, but around the world?
The short answer is yes. We want Europe to spend more. Now, we're all reminded by the old quote about NATO. NATO was designed to keep the Americans in, the Russians out, and the Germans down. That was sort of its founding principles, right? Well, the Germans are certainly much more pacifistic than I think they should be with their economic strength. We need to make sure that Germany plays a more active role within NATO. But at this point, if American defense spending is going down, obviously sequester, no matter what. We do not see continued value in providing thousands of troops in Europe and supporting our facilities there. We're going to be bringing them home. We're going to be reducing an American presence in Europe. So we need Europe to step forward. But I think the fear is politically, Europe does not want to increase its defense spending. It relies on the U.S. security umbrella. It has made that decision. I also fear with its aging population, security is going to start meaning social security, and to pay pensions and very generous social welfare benefits, that's where European governments are going to have to spend. So if we step back and Europe doesn't step up, what happens? Do we have NATO will diminish, or NATO will become less important, or will the security threats that we're seeing coming from the Middle East and North Africa, no one is going to take care of that? That's the real question. I'm hopeful that Europe will want to see why it needs to step forward, but I fear it's not. A good note, the French government announced 2 days ago that they're going to maintain their defense spending at levels last year, and that's really good news. Our British colleagues are cutting back fairly dramatically. That's bad news. The United Kingdom is our best partner when it comes to joint military operations, and as they continue to reduce their defense spending, that will continue to challenge how we work together with them.
Can we really expect Europeans to step up and spend more on defense at a time when they're having a difficult problem just financing their everyday lives?
They won't, and I think that's the scenario, that we're just going to see a diminished role for Europe in security and defense. I think the rhetoric will be positive, but I think the reality will be very different.
And then when there's a crisis in Libya or in Syria, or maybe even in Sarajevo or someplace in Europe, isn't the U.S. going to be continued to be called upon as the leader militarily and politically in those kinds of crises?
I think the United States may be called upon, but they will not answer the call.
So the call will go unanswered?
It potentially will. Certainly in Europe. And I think what will happen, if no one steps forward, then you start getting into, and I described it, sort of the Mali example, where a country may decide it has national interest, it must go, it will deploy. But there may not be others that follow behind it. There may be reasons why others simply will not support the effort. And do you want to see a NATO ally fail once they've committed themselves to an operation? I think what we'll see is NATO in the future, very reduced ambitions. Afghanistan was a turning point for the alliance. They have been in Afghanistan for 12 years. Initially, they thought they would be there for 6 months for a peacekeeping operation in support of the United States. It has turned into, obviously, a much more challenging environment, very unpopular on home. The defense spending that Europe has done has been to support their deployment in Afghanistan. It has been very expensive, even though it's a much smaller contingent than U.S. forces. But all of these combined, I think, will reduce any desire to be more adventuresome, if you will, militarily.
You've said that Afghanistan is very unpopular in Europe. Do Europeans think the job's been accomplished in Afghanistan, assuming we come to the end of that deployment even in the United States or by the United States? Will people think that was worth it? We did the job.
You know, I think, like in the United States, the storyline for Europe has changed about why they're in Afghanistan. So obviously it began 9/11, complete American solidarity. For some European governments, this was not even a conflict. They were sending peacekeeping soldiers to help Afghan girls go to school. The explanations and the reasons why they sent and deployed troops vary from European country to European country. But it has, across the board, particularly in the United Kingdom, is very unpopular. I think they lost the strategic sense for many years, and even up to 2009, the German government refused to call Afghanistan a war. They did not use that word until they had soldiers killed, and there was a very big incident in northern Afghanistan where German forces were deployed. It was the first time that they actually used the German word for war, gefallen. So how each government was describing this for their purposes, they changed. And so it gets more and more difficult as the deployment lengthened, as lives were lost, as the parliaments had to keep approving the deployment. The reasoning got very difficult for Europe.
Now, I know you've said several times here tonight that you don't think Europe is actually going to step up and spend much more on defense. So I guess what I'm about to ask is a bit of a hypothetical question, but for Americans, I think it's not so hypothetical, and that is, if the United States pulls back and cuts defense spending, or at least doesn't increase it, and if Americans decide, hey, we've got to take care of the potholes at home, we're not going to be venturing off to Mali or to Syria or to Libya again or something like that, and the Europeans are forced to step up and do something on their own, how are we as Americans going to feel if one day France or Germany or Britain decides to just, hey, we're going into Afghanistan, we're going into Mali, we're calling on the United States to step in with us? Are we going to be, A, ready to take the number 2 spot in terms of leadership, and B, are we going to step up to that call from NATO?
Great question. 2 thoughts come to mind. You know, I always argue there's 2 types of American leadership in Europe. First type is, we're here, get out of our way, just follow us, we're going to do it. And the other one is, you got this, we're busy, we're out of here. We sort of need that middle, which allows Europe to lead and makes that acceptable to us. And sometimes that's hard. We like to be in control of these things, but have a lot of American engagement. That's the new way that we need to work together. Allow Europe to take the lead, but as Libya showed, let's be clear, we're not taking a back seat. We're in the front seat. We're, if not a co-pilot, we're actually driving it, but it appears that Europe is. We have to be able to accept that new leadership and role. The first part of your question, I literally got a question from a journalist last week. Said, my editor is thinking through a story.
We're so predictable, sorry.
You are so predictable. About, my editor is interested in, is France really re-exerting itself as a military power? And my goodness, what do you mean? And so we talked through the story, and it's funny because a colleague of mine had said at a conference in Europe a few weeks ago that the comment was, the French are acting more like Americans and the Americans are acting more like French. And I said, whoa, those are fighting words, be careful, be careful. But what the thought was, is that France has a very proactive foreign policy. It always has. It was hyperactive under Nicolas Sarkozy, but it's equally active under the new French president, François Hollande. And France is willing to commit itself, absolutely. It's now the Americans that are more reluctant in some ways to recommit. And that's a new leadership paradigm for us. So I do see the scenario, and particularly in North Africa and Francophone Africa, where France has very strong interests, that they would be willing to act unilaterally. And there may not be others coming behind. The EU may not follow behind. Maybe the US won't fall behind. I don't know. But that makes it for a very interesting new dynamic, where a decade ago it was the Americans that were the unilateralists. Are we seeing now a new model where Europe, wanting to step forward, may do so independently of the US? We're in new territory here.
And you've barely mentioned, although you did in your historical overview, Russia. If Europe and the United States are pulling back under your pessimistic scenario, is Russia going to become more dominant in international military involvements, or have they got problems of their own?
I think Russia is actually turning more inward than even we are or the Europeans. I think Vladimir Putin has decided that the outside world is a direct threat to his hold on power, and certainly it creates waves geopolitically and geoeconomically. So if he could, he'd like to hermetically seal Russia off. And I think, again, the example of Cyprus, where a lot of Russian funds were offshore, demonstrates the vulnerability that Europe and the debt crisis and the global economic uncertainty pose. I think Mr. Putin is very worried about Syria for several reasons. He's worried that he fears what happened in Libya will happen in Syria, where a UN security resolution that supports the right to protect people turns into regime change, the ouster of Gaddafi, and that he sees the potential of that same scenario happening in Syria. He has a lot at stake with President Assad staying in power. He has an economic relationship he'd like to preserve, a military relationship, a strategic port on the Mediterranean. And the last thing Mr. Putin wants to see is radicalization of Sunni Muslims in the North Caucasus, where he is particularly concerned about. So for all these reasons, the world presents dangers to Mr. Putin, and certainly the biggest danger may be the United States and shale gas. We are presenting a new challenge to Russian gas that he hadn't anticipated, and that directly affects his economics and the politics of allowing his reliance on oil and gas to help pay for quiet on the home front. So I think Russia will remain a regional power. It will strive to make us pay attention to it at the UN Security Council and arms control. That's where it can play a global role. But its role globally is diminishing. And as Mr. Putin self-isolates and worries about oppressing his opposition, a nascent opposition, and tries to protect Russia from geoeconomics and geopolitics, he's not going to be, I don't think he's going to be active. I think he's going to be less active.
Okay. Remember the keywords shale gas, shale energy. You might want to ask about that later on. I want to give you the opportunity because you did this with our students, and it's a fascinating story. I don't know if you want to do it here or not, but I think your story about how you became involved in Europe and how you went through from the day you graduated as an undergraduate into your career in international relations is a good one. Are you willing to tell some of that story here?
All right, I'm going to bore you for 5 minutes.
This won't bore you, I promise.
I promise. So my last semester at college, I decided to take an internship in Washington, D.C., and I was an intern at the State Department. It was January of 1991 during the Gulf War, the first Gulf War. And I was very fortunate to be in the Bureau of Political Military Affairs, which is a very official sounding bureau that does a lot of political military Defense Department related work. And I had an extraordinary internship because most of my colleagues were sent back to the Pentagon to work for the war. And so I ended up doing a lot of different portfolios. And at the end of the internship, I was asked if I'd like to join the State Department, which I gladly accepted. 6 months later, there was an idea to send humanitarian assistance to the then Soviet Union. It had not collapsed. We had so much excess humanitarian supplies from the Gulf War that thankfully were not used, that the idea was to provide that humanitarian assistance to the very needy in the Soviet Union. It was a very risky operation. To tell you how excited the State Department was, I was their representative at 22 years old. So complete deniable plausibility there if the mission failed. And it was a test case. We arrived in Ukraine and distributed humanitarian supplies to children affected by the Chernobyl nuclear accident. It was the most horrific conditions I'd ever seen in a hospital. It was hard for me to realize what we were so afraid of, the Soviet Union, when they could not provide the basic necessities to their own population. When I got off the airplane, we were met by Soviet military, which was pretty intimidating at the time. And our interpreter told us that the soldier said, "We were told the first time we would see Americans, you would kill us, but instead you bring humanitarian supplies." It was a very moving experience. And then a month and a half later, the Soviet Union collapsed. And I was deployed with several other teams to go back then to Russia and distribute humanitarian supplies in St. Petersburg, Russia. Then Secretary of State James Baker announced Operation Provide Hope, and we deployed humanitarian supplies to 11 out of the 12 new independent states. Georgia at that moment, the Republic of Georgia, was in a civil war. We could not distribute supplies. And I thought this is what a 22-year-old did. We just went and did good things, and it was an extraordinary experience. I came back to the State Department and then was asked to work full-time on a special office that was created to coordinate all the U.S. government assistance, and it was substantial, that eventually went to Russia and the other former Soviet states. Congress passed a special budget, the Freedom Support Act, that supplied the funds to do this. 20 years later, do you believe it, last summer we were still providing medical assistance to some of the most impoverished states in Central Asia. It was about the time that Mr. Putin decided to kick out U.S. NGOs and to believe that foreign aid and U.S. NGOs were foreign agents. So that program has come full circle from collapse to now we're in a different place with Russia. It was an extraordinary experience. After the State Department, I went on to graduate school and worked with my mentor, Rich Armitage, who was put in charge of this new office that was formed. And then in 2000, when Secretary Colin Powell was named, he appointed his deputy secretary, my friend Rich Armitage, and I went back to the State Department as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs, and I looked after Northern Europe, the Nordic countries, and Central Europe, U.S. bilateral relations. My first day, no kidding, was supposed to be September the 11th, 2001. I started the next day, and it was, I felt we were definitely a nation at war. And 4 years later, my last week at the State Department were the London bombings on July 7th, 2005. So I had very important bookmarks for my career. After I left the State Department, and a wonderful experience, I I thought I needed a little break and to reintroduce myself to my family who hadn't seen me for 4 years. And a friend called me who worked at the American Red Cross 3 weeks after Hurricane Katrina and said, "We need you, can you come and just give us help for a couple of weeks?" I said, "Of course." And 3 years later, after a congressional investigation into the American Red Cross, which required a new governing act and lots of other engagement with the International Committee of the Red Cross, I finished my work at the Red Cross, and the Center for Strategic and International Studies called me to do a little work on Europe. And 3 months later, the debt crisis began, and that's where I've been spending my time. I'm a cautionary tale to future employers, can you tell?
Don't hire Heather Conley. The crisis is on the horizon.
The dark clouds form quickly, yes.
Okay, let's go to your questions, and we'll try to alternate again between student questions and non-student questions. And tonight, let's start with a question from a non-student. Is there a question from a non-student? Yes, sir.
You've discussed the different scenarios that you mentioned about how there's a reluctance now. It appears we're pulling apart. Could that be the reason why there hasn't been more of an involvement in the Syrian uprising and the devastation there with a number of people who have been killed?
Okay, question is whether the reluctance that you describe in U.S. involvement is a reason why the United States has not intervened or led an intervention in Syria at this point.
Absolutely. I think President Obama believes his political mandate is to get us out of wars, not get us into new ones. And I think there's an understanding that after the last decade, we're exhausted. We feel exhausted. We feel that we have been stretched too thin, and that, to your point, Ralph, that we need to fill some potholes here. We need to focus our time and energy nation building it here, and I'm completely sympathetic to that, and I understand that. The problem is the world doesn't stop because we need to focus ourselves and focus on ourselves. The world will continue to demand from us and of us. And it's a question of whether we're going to respond to that call. This comes at a time, as I mentioned, it's a crisis of confidence in ourselves and our ability to be effective globally. So what right now for Syria, and we had this discussion at the class time this afternoon, we have to make a decision on where U.S. strategic interests lie. And as the Syrian crisis deepens, as it begins to spill over into other borders, Turkey, a NATO ally, which we are treaty bound to protect, it spills over in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Jordan. And obviously, as the death toll rises, potential for use of chemical weapons or chemical weapons getting into the hands of terrorists, we have to understand that at some point it may be required of us to intervene, hopefully with our European allies. But at this moment, I see continued reluctance, for understandable reasons. But as the more reluctant we are, as I usually find, the greater cost it is for us when we eventually have to intervene. And I fear that may be the case in Syria.
Heather, you said that the world doesn't stop. Could you make an argument that actually in some respects when the United States withdraws and decides it needs to focus on things at home, actors abroad take advantage of the opportunity, the window, and say, oh, look, the U.S. has turned the other direction now. This is our moment to cause some trouble or to accomplish a goal that they have had in mind for a long time. I'm thinking back to the early 90s when the U.S. was withdrawing from the world, from Afghanistan, for example, after fighting the Soviets there. And then Taliban rose, and we paid a price years later. Do people take advantage of the moment when the United States turns away?
Of course. And I think what we're seeing now, the dynamics, again, during the Cold War, we had the luxury of a bipolar world. We sort of knew where everybody was. It was black or white. It was existential, and it was also very focused on Europe, the Fulda Gap. We had extreme focus on Europe then. Today, the global challenges are much more regionally based. So you take, for instance, the South China Sea, the dynamics between China and Japan on the Senkaku Islands. You look at the Korean Peninsula right now. These are much more regional dynamics, meaning that the U.S. has to be present and engaged and focused in Asia. We have to be in the Middle East. We have to be in the Mediterranean and North Africa. We need to be in Latin America. We need to be in sub-Saharan Africa. And it seems as if the complexity requires more of the U.S., not less. But it doesn't necessarily mean that that's more U.S. militarily. I would actually argue less militarily, but more focused on diplomacy and development. And quite frankly, we have to get back to good old-fashioned statecraft, where we're using all of our tools and our resources, whether they're economic, they are values-driven, our diplomats, trying to find creative solutions. That's not always going to come straight from Washington with today's headline and today's policy. That's behind the scenes, that's quiet work. You won't hear about it if it's successful. You'll hear about it if there's a failing. But that's a very different way of doing business. We're still sort of in that Cold War way of doing business. We're still very structured like that, our State Department, our embassy structure. Now is the time to be more nimble and flexible. There's a wonderful quote it's attributed to Winston Churchill. Of course, all good quotes are attributed to Winston Churchill. And it went something like this: "Gentlemen, the money has run out. Now is the time to think." I feel like that's where we are right now. The money has run out. The supplemental budgets. We can't, here DOD, here Defense Department, here's a lot of money, go fix the problem. We actually have to use our ingenuity, our creativity, all of our tools. And we've sort of lost that over the last 10 years. We like to handle it quickly, efficiently. Here, military, you can fix this. That's the last resort. The first resort is all the upfront diplomacy. But that requires funding and engagement to be present and to be involved. It's a very different model. It's very complex. It's balance of power politics like it was 100 years ago in Europe, but it's just more regionally based.
Okay, question from a student. How about a question from a student? Yes, sir.
100 years ago, I don't think anybody would have argued that America and Europe combined represent the majority of the economic and military power of the world. But as we move into sort of the current day, East Asia, India, Latin America all growing in economic strength, do you think it might make more sense to turn outward towards those countries instead of focusing solely on relations with Europe and economics there?
Okay, questioner says that probably 100 years ago we wouldn't have predicted that Europe and the U.S. would be the dominant economic powers of the world. And he's asking, in effect, today, are we missing a boat? Are we not noticing that Asia and perhaps other regions, South Asia and so on, might turn out to be in 100 years from now the big powers of the world?
Thank you, great question. Both we and Europe definitely know where the new potential growth is. That's why President Obama announced his new policy on the Asia pivot, which is now called rebalancing. We understand where the future growth is, and so does Europe. Europe has also pivoted economically to Asia. In fact, the European Union has more free trade agreements in Asia than the U.S. will ever hope to do. They're actually much more active in the trading space than we are. So they completely understand that. The challenge is we're doing it separately, not together, and I'll give you an example. So the EU has a free trade agreement with Korea. The United States just passed that one as well. And so what the Korean government rightly did was they sort of played us off against the EU to get better concessions and trading. And if we would have done that together, a transatlantic Korea free trade agreement, or if we already would have had this new trade and investment partnership, we could gain so much more by doing it together. But we're missing those particular opportunities, I believe. And we need to look at that more closely. But there's also, I think, a bit of myth busting that has to be done. Belgian investment in the United States is larger than U.S. investment in China. Our trading space is so close and so intimate, we don't even see it anymore because it is so deeply entwined. So although we need to go where the new growth is, and the emerging economies certainly are where that is, we can't forget that actually the biggest trading benefits we get are with each other. So it is a turning outward together, but hopefully seeking those opportunities that we're just missing because, quite frankly, both the United States and Europe have agricultural lobbies that don't want to see greater synergies in the trade, and we like to quarrel over how we wash our chickens. But if we can get past that, we actually can see some trade and investment benefit.
Following up on your comment about Europe and the U.S. together doing an Asia trade agreement of some sort, we have as you know, I think I mentioned to you that our program is streamed live on Second Life. We have a question from a viewer in the Netherlands tonight about whether the United States and NATO together should be doing something about the North Korea crisis, the escalation of tensions by North Korea. Is that something that the European alliance should be doing together?
Great question. I don't necessarily see a role for NATO per se, but I think this would be the type of issue where the United States would want to call potentially a North Atlantic Council meeting, which is a convening of the NATO political body, to give an update on what we're seeing, the crisis unfolding, to make sure our European allies understand the situation, understand what we're doing, and then identify ways that they can be supportive. It may mean taking a little pressure for U.S. deployments off of Afghanistan and being able to allow the U.S. some more flexibility if they need to pre-position any forces closer to the Korean Peninsula. It's more awareness. Europe, and this is the challenge as transatlantically we look at Asia, Europe has already economically, they're focusing on Asia, particularly Germany. The German-Chinese economic relationship is growing fairly strong. But our European friends do not have the same security, they don't have the same treaty obligations that we have to South Korea, to Japan. Quite frankly, with the exception of some French and British engagement, they don't have the security footprint in Asia. So I don't see NATO per se being involved, but I see where Europe supports the United States, validates our policies, supports us at the UN, legitimizes our position. That is very, very important as, unfortunately, things continue to escalate on the Korean Peninsula.
Okay, question from a non-student. Yes, sir, in the back here. Yeah, in the middle, yeah, please.
I have two questions. May I ask, please? Number one question is Europe, and number two, Middle East.
Okay.
About Europe, you mentioned the three pillars. I enjoyed that. You're very knowledgeable, and I'm very pleased to meet you.
Thank you.
And so, as Europeans, drifting away, the way I see, away from the United States, it's not like Second World War anymore, it's gone. And do you think the reason is European countries over 400 years ago, 200 years ago, they have colonies, different countries. They were directly, militarily, politically, economically involved in those countries and did whatever they did. Do you think they want to go back, not that picture, not that picture, but economically to developing countries like Brazil and Middle Eastern countries and Asia and get involved with them, and we, U.S., are trying to stop them because we want that. That's my number one question. I want to talk about this.
Oh.
So number two question.
Let's make the second question briefer, please. Can we do that? Otherwise, I'm just going to say just one question.
That's fine. So my number two question is about Iran.
Yes.
And Iran used to be during Pahlavi dynasty, used to have $25–30 billion a year product from the United States. It was a big revenue to the United States. When the revolution started and the religious group came, all that stopped, and Iran is not buying anything from the United States, and the military machines and technology, all that.
Yep.
And all that money is going to China because I know I'm Iranian and I know.
Okay, what's the question?
So my
Got it.
question is that what the United States wants instead of nuclear and atomic bomb? We say we want their economy instead of we want to do trade with them. Is that true?
Okay.
Deep inside.
All right.
Great.
We're going to do two questions here. Let's
Got
do
it.
them. I'll paraphrase them. Number one, the questioner is asking if Europe is trying to, and he's not saying recolonize, but establish relationships as it once had with many, many countries around the world, would the U.S. attempt to stop Europe from engaging in that kind of lucrative trade arrangement That's number one. Would we try to stop Europe from doing that? And number two, with regard to Iran, does the United States, would the United States be satisfied if Iran's trade relationship and its future were tied to China while we were worried about Iran's nuclear development?
Thank you. As far as sort of Europe and sort of what does its colonial past look like today, there are still obviously cultural, historic, economic ties, and certainly the French and Francophone Africa demonstrate that. It's a very delicate relationship, and I think the European countries involved walk very carefully because they are very sensitive to their past. But if you look at the French intervention in Côte d'Ivoire last year, obviously Mali, their previous engagement in Chad, they do so in support and usually have the United Nations or the European Union in a multilateral framework working with them. So it's not just their role bilaterally. The US, I don't think, wants to stop a relationship with Europe and their former colonial powers. I think the United States sees that it's a unique relationship and a very fraught relationship, but we want to work together with Europe, and I think particularly, again, I'll focus on Africa and African countries, certainly sub-Saharan Africa, where we're working closely with Europe to provide development assistance, working together to help build a stronger, better societies. We actually work very collaboratively with each other. Now, not that our sometimes the private sector gets very competitive in these spaces, and we may say the other one's doing something maybe not, we may accuse each other of some little corruption here and there, but I think from a government standpoint, it's a collegial relationship. We recognize the relationship, and I don't think it's something that we should fear. On your question of Iran, I think we have to appreciate that the United Nations, with U.S. leadership, has now passed the 4th round of sanctions against Iran. There have been unilateral sanctions imposed by the United States and by the European Union that go above and beyond the United Nations sanctions. These aren't perfect sanctions. India, for example, has now decided it's not going to respect the sanctions when it comes to oil and gas. Other countries have a broader interpretation of how they're going to implement those sanctions. But I think we're seeing, finally, after nearly a decade of sanctions, beginning to have a very real impact in Iran. Now the question is, does this impact encourage the Iranian regime to seriously negotiate about its nuclear program or not? I tend to think it's not actually propelling the regime to do anything right now in the nuclear area. And I think, quite frankly, we have to wait until the June elections in Iran to really see if there is going to be any movement, which I question. So I think economically, this is not about the United States seeking economic gain. It's worked very closely with Europe. That it took a long time for it to unravel its ties, the European economic ties to Iran, particularly German ties, historic ties, Siemens and others. You look at Italy, Spain, and Greece, the weakest European economies, and they embargoed Iranian oil. I mean, that was a very big deal. That impacted their economies. So I think there's now a greater willingness to impose these sanctions and stick to them. But you raise an interesting point, and it gets back to your shale gas question. We're in the middle of a revolution that we're not quite sure we understand the geopolitical and the geostrategic implications. The discovery of unconventional oil and gas, shale oil, tight oil, has done something phenomenal. It has freed what the U.S. normally imports, particularly for gas. It has freed it on the global market. So all of a sudden, there's global natural gas that's much more available than it used to be.
And cheaper.
And cheaper. And so this is an important question about, potentially could the United States have energy independence, that it would not require oil or gas from the Middle East if it could find its own domestic resources. That's a big question mark. We're not there yet, big question mark. But then as we're thinking about this, so what does that mean? Does that mean that the United States would not have as significant interests in the Middle East? Because we're not going to be getting our oil and gas from the Middle East. We're going to be getting it from the United States or from North America. Who is going to the Middle East to get their energy resources? China. So does the United States, the Fifth Fleet, provide the protection for Chinese tankers to get their oil and gas from the Middle East? I don't know.
That's a traditional U.S. role in the Middle East.
That is one important role. Now, I say that with the caveat that even if today the United States, I could wave a magic wand and the United States became oil and gas independent, we would still be affected by global prices. So if the Iranians would decide to shut down the Straits of Hormuz, our gas prices would spike, even if we're independent, because we are part of a global system, we would react to global prices. But it does put an interesting question for the future. Would our security footprint in the Middle East look different? If we didn't require the oil and gas, we would still have to be there, obviously supportive of Israel. We would have security interest in that region, but they might be different after that. So it's a very big question, and your comment about the economics and the oil and gas, China now will become a much bigger player in the Middle East, but they're not going to do the strategic part that we do. They're there for the resources to take them back to China, I believe. So that's your future lecture, the unconventional oil and gas revolution. Okay,
I'll remember that. Wouldn't we still need, as a nation, though, to provide strategic protection for our friends in Asia who depend, for countries not like China, but like Japan, for example? We provide a lot of security for Japanese oil heading toward Japan. If we didn't do that, would that encourage Japan to build itself up militarily? And what implications would that have for us in Asia?
Right, that's the question. Do we provide the public good at our U.S. taxpayer expense, or do we say, no, that's someone else's, and then other countries are going to build up military capabilities that may, at some point, challenge the United States? So how do you square that circle? And I think that's a very interesting question. For Japan, obviously, after the Fukushima incident, they are rethinking their energy policy, whether it's nuclear, whether it's liquefied natural gas. I think that will certainly be an area where we'll remain very interested. The opening of the Arctic could potentially change and support Asian energy demands. It's pretty far off in the future, but we need to think very new thoughts about providing resources to Asia.
Okay. Question from a student? Question from a student? Yes, sir.
What do you think of the political future of the European Union, with the struggles it's had, obviously, with the monetary union, and sort of the lack of success with austerity and some of the structural inequalities in Latin America?
Okay, question is, what about the future of the European Union, which has depended in large measure on the Eurozone and cooperation on a wide variety of political and especially economic issues? In light of the economic tensions, is the European Union threatened?
That's a whole seminar in and of itself. But
okay, we'll start that one tomorrow night.
Exactly. It's a wonderful question. You have to remember that the European Union is a political project, and its entire purpose was designed to prevent war. Going back to 1951 and the European coal and steel community, the entire idea behind that was to make sure that the war-making industries could not make war against each other. So you have to understand this was about preventing war. Okay, now hyperlink to 2013. Tell the 18-year-old in Spain that can't find a job that the EU is about preventing war, and they'll look at you like, what? The euro, the creation of the European Monetary Union, was the ultimate political project by economic means. And it was introduced in 1991 with the Maastricht Treaty. Why 1991? Well, remember the first picture, the fall of the Berlin Wall? The euro paved the way for German reunification. So the joke goes that, the German Chancellor Helmut Kohl, he gave up the Deutsche Mark, the D-Mark, and in order to allow German reunification to continue. And the whole project was designed to prevent German economic domination of Europe. Okay, check that in 2013. You've got German economic domination of Europe. So what they tried to do, and if you recall back to your American history, we had to go through, Alexander Hamilton had to go through, all the difficulties. We had to make the decision about who divvied up the debt, and then we introduced the currency. Europe has done the absolute opposite. They've introduced the currency first, and now they're trying to figure out how to build the institutions and divvy up the debt, the growing debt that's happening. In some ways, it's a testament to the political project that they've survived the last 4 years. They've done more institution building in the last 4 years than they've done probably in the last 10 to 15. But the problem is they're handling this all very ad hoc, and they're trying to handle the crisis at the moment just to lurch to the next crisis. I'm more pessimistic, as you can tell, about the outcome. I think you're already seeing Europe fragmenting. You're seeing the northern economy starting to form a core, very much focused on Germany. You see a southern European divide. Now the question mark is, where does France go? Will France try to remain globally and economically competitive to stay in par with Germany? And the Franco-German relationship for the last 60 years is what has driven the European Union. It drives policy. It's the co-decision making. Why? Because those two were at war 3 times in the last 150 years. It's designed to prevent war, and that combination has to agree for the European Union to proceed. France is at a total crossroads, and this is the country that I'm watching most closely. There right now, their unemployment is at historic highs. Their competitiveness, their productivity has plummeted. They're in economic contraction. France has to decide whether it's going to take some very painful steps and become globally competitive, or they're going to be protectionist, very nationalistic, and decide that for their interests, it's better to lead the South than to be competitive with the North. How France decides will help shape how that fragmentation works. And if France and Germany, which are now growing so far apart economically, they can't agree on the same policies because the same policies impact them very differently, that is going to cause a lot of tension. Now, we haven't talked about the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom is moving farther and farther away from the European Union, although logically, the last 5 years, the British economy has increased its trade with the European Union. So you sort of go, why are they politically pushing themselves away from Europe? Well, Euroscepticism in the UK has always been there because the British economy is struggling so greatly right now. You have what in essence is economic nationalism. It's easier to blame those rascally Europeans than to say maybe our policies haven't worked out very well. Mr. Cameron has said he will have a referendum in the UK in 2017 to vote whether they can renegotiate their relationship with Europe. I don't believe they will be able to renegotiate that relationship. So at some point, there may come a decision after the UK has elections in 2015. You may see a referendum where the UK decides it needs to leave the European Union, which would be devastating for the UK, it would be devastating for Europe, and it would not serve US interests at all. So we are seeing historical changes in Europe today, driven by the economics, but again, it's the political crisis that we're seeing unfold. And I'm glad you took the picture off of Angela Merkel. And as this continues to deepen and continue to metastasize, if you will, the political friction within Europe is only going to grow, and that should cause all of us a great deal of concern.
You said you're watching France very carefully. Are you optimistic or pessimistic about the tensions between France and Germany?
Mr. Hollande is sending us a lot of mixed signals. He right now has the distinction of being the most unpopular French president in near modern history, so soon after being elected. One day he taxes the wealthy 75%. The next day he gives a business tax rate for the corporations. The next day his economics minister says he's going to nationalize a French steel plant. We're getting a lot of mixed signals from France about what it intends to do economically. And again, it gets back to if France is going to remain globally competitive and have to change its labor laws. I'm so sorry, that 35-hour work week may have to go. The tax policies, the rigidity of the labor laws. Or they're going to say, no, this is how we do it in France, and we are sworn to protect that way of life and that economy, and we're willing to not become globally competitive. Their unemployment rate is really ticking up. Their economic contraction is starting to really cause some problems. And what has been so ironic about this, the European debt crisis, as the bailout packages have increased, German bonds and French bonds have been considered safe havens. So actually, French borrowing costs have been fairly low, but their debt has now gone to 90% debt to GDP ratio. If that safe haven status starts to leave and the market says, wait, I don't like how this economy is looking, their borrowing costs will increase and their margin of error gets more narrow. So I think Mr. Hollande has about 12 to 18 months to make some very declarative decisions on how he's going to transform this economy, and it's a question of whether he has the political leadership and French society is willing to accept that dramatic change to move forward. But I'm very concerned about Germany is doing so well and the rest of Europe is doing so poorly, and you cannot contain that divergence in a monetary union. It won't hold.
Question from a non-student. Yes, sir.
In Iraq and Afghanistan, the U.S. has received a significant amount of support from so-called new European powers, countries like Slovakia, Romania, and Poland. They were there from the beginning and they're still there. My question is, are these countries dependable new European allies, or are they economic opportunists?
Okay, question is, in the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, the United States has received considerable support, military support and political support from the so-called New Europeans, the former Warsaw Pact nations. The question is, are these countries dependable in the future to support the U.S. militarily and politically?
What's so interesting, and thank you for the question, because this was something that I was responsible for in the State Department during the Iraq War. Central Europe was very supportive of the United States for historical reasons. They saw the United States as supporting them, the captured nations policy that through the darkest days of the Warsaw Pact and communism, that we stuck by them. And then after the end of the Cold War, our assistance to help these countries transform from a communist state to a market economy, our leadership role was huge. And when these countries entered NATO and eventually the EU, they saw that this was their turn to support the U.S. when we needed their support. It was not an easy choice for them. Afghanistan, easier because of not only the attack, the UN resolution, NATO, it allowed the new allies to actually perform and show us how they would perform as allies, and it was very supportive. They were very supportive. The Iraq War was a very different story. In 2003, 10 of the Central and Eastern European countries were about to join the European Union, and the pressure that was placed on them by the then French President Jacques Chirac and German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder was unbelievable, threatening their future EU membership if they supported the U.S., which was sort of what caused Secretary Rumsfeld to utter the famous New Europe, Old Europe phrase. And the Central Europeans did come to, and supported us in Iraq at their risk, at their own risk. I would say that in Iraq, the Central Europeans thought that there would be greater economic advantage. Just as a trivia, Poland was our protective power in Baghdad. So the Polish embassy conducted U.S. diplomacy as it was in Iraq and closed the doors right before the invasion. So we had a special relationship with Poland because of that special status. But the Central Europeans were deeply disappointed they didn't get the economic benefit that they thought and contracts they thought may be there in Iraq. And eventually public opinion began to turn so sour that the governments could not continue to sustain their efforts in Iraq, but they did continue to support us in Afghanistan.
How about a question from a non-student? Non-student? So, all right, ma'am, yep.
We need diplomacy. How solid is our diplomatic infrastructure?
Okay.
Names that we used to know, and I don't know any.
Okay. You
question.
talked earlier about the importance of diplomacy and using that kind of power in the future in the United States. The questioner is asking, how strong is our diplomatic infrastructure?
It is strong, but it needs to be much stronger. And how do you strengthen it? Well, of course, you financially, you provided the resources that it needs to recruit the best and the brightest when the private sector has a much better salary and bonus package. The diplomatic service has to reflect and look like America. It needs to be diverse. It needs to represent, and it represents all Americans. And so the Foreign Service needs to do, and the Foreign Service would admit this, not me saying it, that it needs to do a much better job of diversity and growing that. Quite frankly, we have to value our diplomats as much as we value other public servants like our armed forces and those who protect U.S. interests overseas. Sometimes I think they're unappreciated. Diplomats are sometimes stereotyped that, oh yes, they go to cocktail parties overseas and have a marvelous time. The Foreign Service officers I know work 7 days a week. They are there when an American loses a passport. Tragically, if there's a death, has to be there and contact the family. They do all those important services, and their lives are in danger every day. U.S. embassies are targets, whether you're in the Middle East or you're in Europe. And that should be recognized and valued in our society as much as we value the brave men and women who protect us overseas militarily. You know, it all comes down to one basic thing, and this is not a secret to any of us. It's leadership. And we need to grow great leaders, American leaders who want to serve their country honorably. We need to, and I think we're losing this art. We don't create the Henry Kissingers and the Brent Scowcrofts and the Zbigniew Brzezinskis, who are these huge strategic names who think not in days, but think in millennia of how U.S. policy and international relations move. What we're producing are people who are very artful at spinning and the headline management of the day, but not thinking where we need to be as a country in the next 10 to 20 years and what's the best position. We need to grow those thinkers. I'm sure we're growing them here at the University of Delaware. I feel very confident of that. Oh.
You met them at dinner.
I met them all at dinner, and boy, were they asking me some tough questions. But it's, again, what we value and the leadership, and I'm very biased. I had the great privilege of working under Colin Powell, and he was a daily lesson for me in leadership and how you work with others and how you do the right thing. I hope we can all take inspiration from our mentors and our leaders, but that's what we need in our foreign service, not just at the Secretary of State level, which is the name we hear all the time, but at every level of our diplomatic support. So here's to all the students: go take the Foreign Service exam, go try it, or become a civil servant. What a pleasure it is to serve in the State Department. Thank you for your question.
Well, before we say thanks to Heather Conley tonight, let me tell you a little bit about our next program. You heard Heather earlier speak about the importance of development assistance in Africa and elsewhere. 2 weeks from tonight, on April 17th, we'll meet Iris Mwanza from Zambia in Africa. She's a young entrepreneur working to bring online access to remote areas of Africa for commercial purposes. She's also worked in one of the largest anti-AIDS non-governmental organizations, also in Zambia, and she did a stint at the World Bank in Washington. She'll talk about the role of the U.S. in Africa and the developing world. I really urge you to come for that program. To be sure you don't miss announcements about programs like these, if you're not already on our email list, be sure to put your name and print clearly your email address on one of those bright orange sheets on the table in the lobby on your way out tonight. Now, please let's thank Heather Conley for coming to the University of Delaware tonight. Good night, everyone.